My name is Chris Kenyon. I chair Labour Cycles. We are a national organisation within the Labour Party with members in about 80 constituencies. And we're very focused on the policy and politics of the short journey. Historically, Labour has done a lot of work around trains and buses, but we really focus on the public policy implications of how we get to our school, how we go around our communities, walk to local shops. Why have we assembled this panel of fantastic speakers from across the country? Well, as lockdown eases over the coming weeks, we're going to face an unprecedented set of challenges about how we move. Surveys, both in China and a recent survey done by Auto Trader in the UK, shows an almost halving of the public's willingness to take public transport. And perhaps more alarmingly, if we are to do any form of social distancing on our buses, our trams, or on the tube or train network, we might be talking about a capacity drop of almost 90%. In London alone, that would be almost 8 million journeys that we will need to find a way of doing something else. And while there is a lot of talk, and obviously there is a plan to encourage people to homework for as long as possible, it's clear we are going to have to find other ways to get people moving. The economic restart we need as a country would be choked off if even a fraction of those 8 million journeys goes into cars. And we have to acknowledge that with universal access to sat-nav, just a small increase in cars on our streets is capable of grinding cities designed in the 19th century to a halt. So what public policy challenges does that offer up and give to councils? Well, it requires decisions, otherwise we face instant conflict between a huge increase in demand for walking and cycling and a potential increase in demand for private car use. As with so much in this crisis, our view is that many of the solutions are going to have to happen locally. And while many people are waiting for answers from the Secretary of State, really the answers lie in local councils across the country, many of whom have already taken action, in many cases at really quite extraordinary speed, to both anticipate the challenges that lie ahead for the UK, but also then to make decisions about how they allocate that scarce road space. Before I go to the panel, just a little bit of housekeeping. We are in this Zoom webinar format. If you've got questions at the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A button. And I'd encourage specific questions, please use the Q&A function. If you've got general comments or links to other things that you want to share with the group, please use the chat function. And secondly, I'd just like to remind both my panelists and everybody on the call that we've got a wide variety of councils across the country. It's very easy to get focused on the specifics of large city settings. We have smaller towns with a variety of access to public transport. So this impact of public preferences for public transport dropping are going to be different. And also a reminder that we have towns where control of the highways budget and indeed control of their roads may sit with a county council. So on that note, I'd like to get started and turn to Claire Holland, who's Deputy Leader of Lambeth Council, has the environment and the transport portfolio there, and was, while Brighton I think beat you to being the first council to announce a road closure, what Lambeth have announced is a strategy, and they're the first in the country to announce an emergency action plan around COVID. So perhaps Claire, if I can turn to you, could you share a little bit about what you've announced and why you've moved so quickly as a council on this?
Thank you very much, Chris. Yeah, so I think as everywhere else, we were seeing under COVID that people are using our streets differently. As you said, that families are out walking and cycling and joggers are running in the middle of the road. And we also saw car speed spiralling because of fewer cars on the road. And all this whilst having to socially distance safely. So we were acutely aware that our residents in Lambeth were putting themselves at risk of one danger to avoid another. tiny context for Lambeth for people who don't know it. We're in a city London borough. 70% of our households live in flats, and we have a third of our children growing up in poverty. And the majority of our households in Lambeth don't own a car. So running through all of this is an equalities issue for us as well. So as you said, Chris, we were the first council to publish our emergency transport strategy in response to COVID-19, and we broke it down into phases. The most immediate action we took was the pavement widening, and we did this at the worst pinch points in the borough. Now, these are quite temporary and rudimentary measures involving barriers building out into the traffic lane. And we used utility permit regulations to do this. I understand that other councils have used events regulations. We've already implemented the first ones last week in different places in the borough. And last night with TfL introduced pavement widening on Brixton High Road. For anyone who knows Brixton, that's right in the middle of Brixton. So that's quite a bold measure to take. And it's running between the KFC and Iceland because there was a real problem with social distancing there. But then we were looking at how do we manage our transport system safely now in lockdown and as restrictions ease. We know that there's going to be some form of social distancing in place generally, and as you said, Chris, the capacity on public transport is going to be down for a variety of reasons, and in London that is really significant. We don't know what the detail of these easing of restrictions will be yet, and that's one thing that has been difficult and challenging in COVID is sometimes a lack of detail, so leaving us to interpret. But we do know that children will be going back to school, residents will be going back to work, and we need to enable them to be able to access our town centres safely by walking and cycling, because as you said, we're expecting a rush back to the car. So it's how do we manage that safely, and how do we enable people to move around their neighbourhoods, to walk and cycle to the town centre? How do we prevent our roads becoming clogged up again, the rat running, and returning to the dirtier air that we had before, which we know has a profound impact on our health? So last year we published a transport strategy and implementation plans. Now that was quite an ambitious strategy that built on healthy routes we'd already worked out and looked at creating low traffic neighbourhoods throughout our borough on a rolling basis and when resources allowed us to. And we were also already undertaking some specific bigger projects, for example, Transport for London, such as Brixton Liverpool neighbourhood. So our emergency strategy, we built on that data and evidence that we already had. And what we're going to be doing is we're accelerating those measures. So this may involve no entries, it may involve restricted access, modal filters, barriers across the road. I mean, we're going to constantly have to review our programme because it is an emergency response, so we need to be agile and responsive. So the first one we're introducing in the next few weeks is a low traffic neighbourhood area in the north of the borough. We already have a temporary traffic order in place in this area because it's part of the Vauxhall Nine Elms development area. So we didn't have to do that, and that has enabled us to be responsive and agile, as I said. And then we're moving on to another area just south of Brixton, because we know that's a key route of residents coming from the south of the borough into Brixton town centre, as I said, to access employment, shopping, to support our local economy, to get it back up and running. In terms of challenges ahead, and we're going to expand this out to other areas, and we're looking at things like temporary bike lanes as well. So it's all in the report, it's in phases, and we're adding to the report as time goes on, and we're learning more about how we do this in these unprecedented times.
So on that note, one thing that was interesting, I think will be interesting to many of the people dialed in, is you did something unusual, or relatively unusual. You issued a borough-wide traffic notice about the need to make plans, that you have a evolving traffic order plan for the whole borough. And my impression, talking to traffic engineers, is that something that then accelerates your ability then to make further changes as time passes. Is that right?
That's right, absolutely. So as I said, we already had one in place in the north of the borough because since 2016, because of the huge construction works that have been going on in Vauxhall development area. But yes, we're introducing a whole borough-wide traffic management order, and then doing the specific regs that we need to in the different areas, which does mean that we can be more responsive, absolutely. And I know there's been a lot of talk about should it be an experimental traffic order or whatever, and I know I'm not a traffic engineer, I'm not a town planner or anything, but I know there are different sections, and ours is under section 14 of the Road Traffic Regulation Act, I think 1983, I think it is, I'm not sure. But for us, that we feel that that gives us, it enables us to have a strategy so that we can then within that make changes and be more responsive. Subject to funding, which I do have to touch on, Chris, because funding is obviously key. In our first phase, we got £78,000 agreed, and that was basically to do that immediate pavement widening and to pay for the borough-wide traffic order, etc. We're going to need to release more funds, and what concerns us is the dire situation in London of Transport for London and how that's going to impact for London councils and those other major projects and that interplay with TfL. And also we know that we've had 10 years of austerity, so we weren't in great positions anyway financially as councils, but also we really want to ensure that the government do stick to their pledge and do pay us what we need for these emergencies, because this is our response to COVID-19.
But I think that's going to be very clear. I mean, I think a big question for central government will be whether or not it wants to continue with a commitment to £27 billion of new road building, or whether or not it meets what certainly the Labour Party called for in the last general election, which is that 10% of the transport budget, which is about £3 billion a year, must be committed on an ongoing basis to active travel, both walking and cycling. I just want to, I'm going to go around the panel, and I want to come back, I know we'll have lots of questions. Just a couple of things for folks who are dialed in. The hashtag for this call is #StreetSpace, and I'm also going to launch a poll for councillors or council officers who are dialed in, just asking you some questions about where you are in your planning process. That's going to be kept anonymous, but it's useful for us to have data about how people are approaching it nationwide. So on that, I just want to move across to Professor Rachel Aldred. Recently, Professor, congratulations. You've done a huge amount of work looking at the impacts of travel on different groups, and I was interested in, if we are as a society going to rely on cars for more journeys over the next 6, 12, 18 months, what would the impact on the most disadvantaged be, Rachel?
Sure. Thanks, Chris, and it's great to be part of such a brilliant panel. And I know we've got very limited time and you want to hear from people who are actually building stuff at the moment. So I'm going to be brief, but I did want to start by talking about the potential of the current situation to allow us to start doing things differently. So the situation is obviously very difficult, but one thing we can see is that habits can change very, very quickly. Normally, when we're thinking about future transport systems as academics, we struggle to imagine, say, a 10% increase in home working. But at the moment, everybody's routines are changing so much. So to give one example, physical activity. Research by Sport England at the moment suggests that 1/3 of people are getting less exercise than before the coronavirus, but 1/3 of people are getting more exercise. So big changes in what people are doing, both negative and more positive. And the challenge there will be to ensure that the people getting more exercise now keep doing so, while the people who are doing less revert to what they were doing before. But conversely, the risk is that people who are getting less exercise stick with their new habits, and those who are currently doing more go back to the old pattern. So there's the potential for a lot of change, both negatively and positively. And that's also the case in relation to transport and travel. So in terms of active travel, the immediate challenge is the potential for not just resumption in car use, but also of hundreds of thousands of more cars on the roads. if people switch from public transport to the car. So if we think about the fact that 2/3 of people who were previously commuting by public transport have access to a car, and 1/4 of people who normally commute by public transport live in a household with more than one car. So there's an awful lot of scope for an increase in car trips. You know, if public transport capacity or demand drops to 1/5 or 1/6 of normal levels, what will people's alternatives be? And, you know, we need to think about the fact that people, you know, if people don't have good choices, people will make bad choices, and we have to create the conditions for them to make good choices. So for that 1/3 of public transport commuters, people who would normally commute by public transport, who don't have a car in the household, you know, the picture could be really quite bleak. They may experience unsafe conditions on public transport, reduced services, even higher fares. People may have seen the IFS report suggesting that fares on public transport should be raised, which obviously will hit those who have no alternative hardest. And the figure is higher in terms of not having access to a car for people who habitually commute by bus or by coach. So around 2 in 5 of those commuters have no car in the household. And we know that car ownership is lowest for groups like single parents, disabled people, Black and minority ethnic and low income people. So people who are already marginalised or vulnerable are going to be are going to have the least alternatives and be most at risk. So some of these people would need to keep using public transport, but others potentially could use active transport modes. 3/4 of bus or coach commutes are under 10 kilometres. So there's a lot of scope for shifting to the car, but there's also a lot of scope for active travel to help deal with this issue around public transport capacity. But if even some of the 2/3 of public transport commuters with car access start driving, then the impact on town and city streets is just going to be horrendous. I mean, imagine London with 1/3 more private car trips going in to work in the morning. You know, buses stuck in congestion, air pollution up, carbon emissions up, walking and cycling further marginalised, and this all impacts worse on the poorest. We know Danny Dorling has done some great work on this. We know that places with the worst air pollution tend to be urban areas with large numbers of low-income families living without cars who are suffering from the impact of other people's travel. So I very much agree with Claire that it is an equity issue, it is a social justice issue. And we can imagine a world where all those people who can switch from public transport to car for understandable reasons, but it means that other people basically have a choice between public transport, which may be getting worse, maybe more expensive, maybe more unsafe, cycling in conditions that could be very hostile and congested, and walking on narrow footways which don't allow for physical distancing. There was some great work out of UCL by Nicholas Palominos and colleagues showing just how many footways, even in London, didn't have enough space for people to walk past each other safely, you know, adhering to physical distancing.
Yes, and that was quite extraordinary data. It looked at as almost 2/3 of pavements in London are simply just not wide enough for the basic social distancing. And it's quite stark in some ways. I think councils have understandably been, and appropriately, been guiding the 2-metre guiding social distancing rules for parks. And yet the hard reality is most of our high streets aren't going to support that. And certainly a walk around most high streets at the moment, just a simple queue outside a shop illustrates how we've allocated space. Okay, so there are some very serious equity issues here. I'd like to go to Wasim Zafar, Councillor Zafar in Birmingham. You're the largest unitary authority in Europe, and the second obviously largest city in the UK. Could you maybe talk to me a little bit, or talk to us all about what changes you see, where you are in your own planning? Claire had mentioned sort of some immediate actions, and then there's going to be some more medium-term acceleration of long-term plans. Can you share a little bit more about where you are?
So Birmingham, good evening, Chris, and good evening to everybody. Birmingham's been on a bit of a journey with respect to how we want people and goods to move across our city. In January, at the start of the year, we launched our draft Birmingham Transport Plan with 4 big moves. And the key headline that came out of the Birmingham Transport Plan, the draft Birmingham Transport Plan, was my comment that car would no longer be king in Birmingham, and historically being the motor city and Brummies have a love for car, and quite clearly there's a massive over-reliance of private car in our city. But to tackle the congestion, the high illegal and unsafe levels of air pollution in the city, we had to change our ways. And the 4 big moves in the transport plan are very relevant to the environment that's been created because of COVID. The 4 big moves very quickly are reallocating road space from car to buses, cycling and walking, recreating the city centre where public transport and buses and cycles have priority over car, and restricting the flow of private car through the city centre. Probably the most important of the 4 big moves is creating active neighbourhoods within our city, and 4, parking and using parking as a demand management tool, and with respect to pricing and availability of parking.
And is Active Neighbourhoods, sorry, Councillor Safar, so is Active Neighbourhoods the brand, or is that your local brand for low traffic neighbourhoods or livable neighbourhoods? Okay. Absolutely,
it's where cars become less dominant. One of the key things within that is we want Birmingham to become a 20-mile-per-hour default city. It also helps us economically. We've trialled that 20 mile per hour. 90% of the roads within Birmingham are residential roads. So we want to make people who walk and cycle, and who are currently be doing that during this COVID lockdown, to take, to recapture the streets of private car, and to reimagine streets in a different way. So with respect to our plans, we were just coming towards the end of our consultation for the transport plan, and we went into lockdown. And for me, COVID has sort of acted as a catalyst for bringing forward some of those changes. Usually the transport plan wouldn't be adopted until later in the year, but we have to move quite quickly with respect to some of the plans. And we'd be really, really keen to do that, because COVID has brought, the biggest threat to us is public transport. We were really on a journey with getting bus usage and bus patronage in our city and region going through the roof, increasing substantially over the last 12 to 18 months. But currently, like everywhere else, we've got clear challenges with getting people back onto buses. I'm a bus user. I've got underlying health issues. I'm a type 2 diabetic, and I think twice now about whether I should be using the bus or not. And I'm sure there's thousands of people across the country who feel in that similar way. So for those shorter journeys in particular, getting people walking and cycling is essential. So just to give you a snapshot, in Birmingham, pre-COVID, a quarter of the journeys in the city, less than 1 mile, are less than 1 mile by private car. So over 300,000 journeys were taking place any working day, less than 1 mile in private cars. So if you could take them out, walking and cycling, that would be a phenomenal change in air quality, in congestion in the city.
Can I just interrupt there? So just clarify for everyone listening in. Sorry, what percentage of your journeys are less than 1 mile by car?
A quarter of the journeys that take place in our city are up to 1 mile. And
it's interesting. I mean, nationally, it's about 50% of journeys are less than a 20-minute bike ride. I mean, that's the scope that we have to deal with here. One last question, just for you. You've done some very brave things already in Birmingham, and I know many have seen your leadership there with the community. We were at an event just last summer with you. Do you think that the public's attitude and willingness to see quite significant changes to road has changed just from being able to walk and cycle around neighbourhoods more easily?
Definitely. The challenges we've had with trying to get our clean air zone through, getting some other very difficult projects through, as we know, I've been damned and labelled as being quite unpopular as a politician in the city, because I'm willing to make those brave changes in our localities. But some of the comments that are coming through on social media, in particular, people saying clean, feeling the clean air that this lockdown has created, and really demanding that the lobbying that's taken place, in particular on social media from Brummies, who are demanding that we push forward with our plans for better walking facilities, in particular on our high streets. And we've announced 2 today in Erdington and King's Heath, and these are 2 of many more that are becoming in the near future. And also to build on the work that we've done around cycling. We've launched 2 blue cycle lanes, segregated cycle lanes on the A34 and A38 in Birmingham, We spent £15 million on towpaths, on our canals network, but people are demanding far more, and we absolutely have to give more. There's an issue of resources, but with the government's announcement, the Prime Minister's support for more walking and cycling facilities, we hope that's backed up with some money too. And we'd be more than keen. We have to do it. There's no two ways about it. And we'd like to see this as the new normal. We don't want to go back to how our cities, towns and cities were behaving and how they looked prior to this.
So, and I think that's a question I want to pick up in a minute, because I think there is this question of emergency and experimental orders, and how do you bridge what are emergency reactions to a crisis to longer term strategies that may have either existed before or are becoming clearly now politically desirable. I'd like to go to Councillor Lokes, who's the Deputy Leader of Waltham Forest. And for those of you who don't know, I don't think there's anybody in the UK who's done more work over the last 5 years in terms of rolling out walking and cycling infrastructure, and then going and telling the tale, and also I think welcoming half the councils in the UK to Waltham Forest to show them of his work. So Councillor Lokes, I'd firstly like to hear a little bit about what you're doing, and you had a lot of ongoing projects in already ongoing, but you've already announced some emergency measures. I'd like to start there, and then I've got some follow-up questions because I think you have more experience than most on how you can do things quickly and about political buy-in. So maybe if you could just share a little bit about what your plans are right now.
No, I'll mute myself. Okay, can you hear me now?
We can.
Thank you, and thanks for arranging this session. I think it's really, really useful. I want to keep it relatively brief though, because I'm conscious of time, and probably lots of people got questions, and quite a lot's already been said. So very briefly, from today, we've started stripping out car parking spaces in our town centres to increase the width of pavements, because clearly we're going to need to be practicing social distancing for some time to come. We've got a new batch of school streets that are ready to go as soon as schools go back, maybe end of May. There was some suggestions of June, so they're ready to go. So not only they were planned already, but clearly they have more significance now. We've got a couple of temporary.
Actually, can I just hold you there? Because I don't think it may not be obvious to everybody who's dialed in what a school street is. I know they do exist in a number of authorities across the country, but they're not common. Could you just share with people what they are?
School streets where you restrict access into a road, that perhaps the school gate for primarily primary schools, it tends to be, because they're the ones where we still have significant transportation of children by private motor car on a daily basis, morning and afternoons, and you restrict the access to just residents of that road only, so parents can't drive into that road and literally drive onto the school playground and into their school gate to deposit their children. So it means you're seeking and encouraging more children to kind of walk and cycle, particularly in a city like London, where actually you tend to be very close to your local primary school. There's simply no real excuse for you to be driving your children to school. And then you're building in that daily exercise routine that's not only kind of helping address kind of air quality by not taking out private cars from the road in the AM and PM peaks, but you're also kind of addressing issues around kind of daily exercise, and therefore picking up on issues around obesity, which are big kind of challenges in places like Waltham Forest. So that's school streets, and you enforce it, and you issue, we've been using cameras to enforce ours to date, and you issue fines for any vehicles that aren't allowed into those streets.
So for people in the audience who are interested in that, we will do there'll be a follow-up email with any resources that get mentioned in this call. And I know Hackney Council have put together a very
Hackney are really big on it. Hackney are really big on it. Big out to Hackney. We copy Hackney in this instance. So thank you, John Burke, if he's here, and Ferriol Clark before him. So that's school streets. So we've got another package of those, and we've got we're currently working on the designs for some temporary segregated cycle tracks that we think we can introduce on top of already the extensive cycle tracks that we've been putting in over the past couple of years. And then looking to roll out further our low traffic neighbourhood schemes. We've got a couple that we were planning to do permanently this year. Obviously budgets have been hit hard, so probably some of the fixtures and fittings of those may not be as we originally planned, but we'll still go ahead with those schemes, and we're looking to kind of introduce some other schemes where residents are calling for us to do it, and using the opportunity that's been built up over lockdown for people to kind of experience life without through traffic, speeding through traffic through their neighbourhoods, to kind of reinforce some of the messages and embed active travel, walking and cycling as the norm as we come into the new normal. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I want to pick up on a couple of things there. I think for many councils who are dialed in, you may not have experience of doing low traffic neighbourhoods, and the data from Waltham Forest is just extraordinary in what you've done in the last 4 years. I know an average increase in walking of almost 35 minutes, I believe, per resident, which if you think at a borough-wide level, it's the equivalent of 5 football stadiums doing a park run every week. It's just an extraordinary creation of active travel. But we are in a crisis, and it beholds us to work out how to move quickly and cheaply and at scale. And I think the question for many on the call will be, you had a good amount of time and pretty generous funding from TfL for the rollout of the mini holiday programme in Waltham Forest. Is it possible to do large-scale interventions on low-traffic neighbourhoods cheaply? I mean, I heard one council leader talk at the end of last week saying, bizarrely, because it needs to be done as an emergency, that there is a very shortened consultation period. And actually, if you strip out a lot of the more public realm stuff that gets added in to sell the project, if it just has to be done as an emergency, it might be possible to do quite large schemes cheaply and quickly. Do you think that's possible? You've got more experience than anybody else in the country on this.
It's definitely possible to do it cheaply. It's definitely possible to do it easily. And as long as you've got, the political will to do it, you can make it work, and your officers will have huge amounts of data that can influence the right interventions, even the right cheap interventions at the right locations, to really make a difference, to ensure that what you're not doing is just pushing problems into other kind of local neighborhoods. So you then kind of get a negative reaction, and the window that we have in response to relaxation of lockdown will be small, so we have to all hit the ground running, and we have to build this into what our officers and our councillors will be planning for the new normal. This needs to be a key feature of the new normal, just as social distancing is going to be with us for the next 12 months, probably, just as X, Y, and Z is going to be with us. This is a key part of the overall response, because we know people aren't going to be able to use tube and buses and trains in the way that they have done. And we certainly don't want to be encouraging them all to get back into their private owned cars and start driving everywhere. That is the wrong approach. This is the right approach, and it can be done. And you just got to push hard. You've got to push hard, and I say to people, I came into politics to make a difference, not to manage the status quo. All the evidence is on our side for those of us that want to push these interventions and these responses. Now is the time, and whatever the political consequences, you are doing the right things for the right reasons, and we've got to stick to that. And and if we're all doing it rather than random councils here and there trying to do it, then we will really build a movement that finally embraces and embeds active travel as part of the norm as opposed to the exception.
Yeah, well, yes to that. I'm sure that's common for everybody on the call. I've got one last question, because this is a moment that requires political bravery, and it's interesting, the poll results are in from people dialed in. It looks like only 20% of councils who are dialed in have got an emergency transport plan drafted, it looks like we've got 60% who are in discussions but haven't got anything drafted. They are going to face opposition, and some of it will be very vocal. But I know you did some recent survey data asking your communities whether or not they could imagine going back to life before you did this work. Can you share the results of that, because they were quite extraordinary?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have those data. I don't keep stats to hand. I speak more from the heart rather than the brain. Rachel's the one I go to for kind of stats on this sort of stuff. I mean, it was overwhelmingly no one would go back to what they had before. And the interesting thing from the early consultations, so we had 2 consultations out of all of the ones that we did that we lost, because all of the schemes we implemented had the public on side. They wanted these schemes, but the 2 that we lost, immediately afterwards, we were starting to be lobbied for those people to be reconsulted, because they were starting to see the difference that was being made in those other neighbourhoods who had voted, had supported the schemes that we were talking about, the radical interventions about prioritising neighbourhoods for people rather than a form of transportation. And both of those schemes we've reconsulted in the last 6 months, and they've both come back overwhelmingly in support of taking forward our proposals, and this year they'll finally be getting what they should have had 5 years ago, but at least they now accept that this is the right thing to do.
Rachel, please correct me if I'm wrong, but my recollection is the data is about 94% approval, or residents saying they didn't want to go back to how it was before. But please correct me. I'm sure somebody on Twitter or on chat will.
Dan Kelly's on here. He will
get it in the chat. Okay, I'd like to move over to Leicester. I mean, one of the interesting things about the last 2 months is not only has it profoundly changed our approaches and the way that the public thinks about the role of schools in supporting our communities, and it's, I think, really brought a clear spotlight on the fact that our communities are built at the school gate. It's also reminded everybody of the critical role, obviously, that the NHS plays in our communities. And I wanted to go to Councillor Clark in Leicester, and I think you were the first council in the country to roll out key worker corridors, as I believe how they've been branded. But could you tell us a little bit more about what you've done in Leicester and how you've managed to move, again, just remarkably quickly?
Sure, thank you ever so much for the opportunity to talk to you this evening. So we've set up what we've called the Key Worker Corridor, which is basically a kilometre of segregated cycleway going to the south of the city, which is adjacent to our Leicester Royal Infirmary in the city centre. To be honest with you, there's a lot of serendipity in delivering the Key Worker Corridor, because we did go through a list of potential schemes, and it happened that the most deliverable scheme was the one that would be most helpful to staff at the Leicester Royal Infirmary, and it's been received incredibly well. As one of my colleagues put it, the amount of publicity we've got for sticking out a load of traffic cones has been incredible. And I got my the political correspondent of the Leicester Mercury to Google tactical urbanism, which I thought was an achievement in itself as well. So we've been overwhelmed by the response. The usage seems high at the minute. One count I saw today was 1 cyclist a minute on the Key Worker Corridor and going upwards. And we're also therefore looking at other options and other opportunities. I think one of the things that's worth, or 2 things worth kind of feeding into the debate this evening is, that's been an enabler. One is the work of partners, so the work of organisations like Sustrans, who we work very closely with, and I think making sure that you've got really robust partnerships and a really robust cycling and walking community that you lobby with and not against is really important. We all get it. It doesn't feel brave to us. It feels right to us. And the other one is the role of behaviour change. We have infrastructure and we have behaviour change, and they need to go hand in hand. So from my perspective, the work we've been doing in giving out free bicycles, our free bike loan, and our free bike fix program through something called Bike Aid actually goes hand in hand with the work we're doing in providing that segregated infrastructure for our key workers. And I have to say the feedback we've had from those who've received bikes and used those traffic cones has been overwhelming, and both locally, both around local authorities nationally, but also around the world too. So we think we're demonstrating that's the right thing to do, so we're looking to go bigger and better.
It's extraordinary how much goodwill and how well that has gone down, both in the local press and national press. And again, I think that captures the moment that that there is an appetite publicly for people to make real change about how we allocate road space.
I think our ability to show fleet of foot is built on over a decade of skills development, partnership development, expertise, and some really fantastic officers within the City Council as well that have enabled it to happen.
Thank you, Councillor Clark, for joining us. I wanted to go back and, or have I lost? Sorry, I want to go back to Councillor Holland in Lambeth with a question. Often in the large cities, there are authorities. We don't all have the benefit of the control that Wasim has in terms of a unitary authority in the city. And obviously we have Transport for London, which is very well resourced and well-meaning. In London, there are metro planning authorities both in Liverpool and Manchester. But I know there's been a movement now amongst borough leaders to say it's not enough just to wait for TfL to say what the plans are. We really, as councillors, need to engage much more proactively ourselves in leading that conversation with the community. And I've noticed that you're really engaged with community groups in Lambeth, and you've found a way of harnessing their insight about what good looks like to really build a movement within the council. Can you share a little bit more about who you liaise with there and how you've built that politically?
Yeah, I mean, I worked very closely with a variety of organisations. I guess the key ones would be Lambeth Cyclists, Living Streets, Mums for Lungs, organisations such as that, where when I first inherited this portfolio a couple of years ago, it's in 2018, I sort of approached it with, these are the people that are going to be criticising me all the time. These are the people that I'm going to have to be defensive with. And then when I started talking to them, I realised actually I needed them. And I needed them because they're the ones that are pushing me. They're the ones that are saying, why are you doing that? You know, how is this impacting the clean air? You know, this is whatever. And so I actually realised that actually my immediate default position of negativity was a totally wrong one to have, and that they're passionately committed people. They're working really hard in voluntary capacities in their communities and building up a huge amount of expertise. And so we've spent a lot of time meeting each other, discussing through projects, and discussing high-level principles. We're quite robust with each other, and I'm hoping that I feel that we have built up a genuinely trusting relationship, so that when we challenge each other now, that's based on trust and credibility, so that rather than it just being knee-jerk and defensiveness. So I think it's actually made us much better as a council, and it was really crucial in our emergency strategy and response that I was able to go to them and speak to them as well, and to get their input and to get their ideas. And yeah, so I think it actually has made us much better and more responsive and more outward looking as a council. And I'm actually really grateful for the time that they put in and the expertise that they share with us. I don't know if that's answered your question, Chris.
No, it does. I'm scanning questions live to
right.
process them. I'm not ignoring you. I think this is really important, which is that good low traffic neighbourhoods require local knowledge. Like there are set formulas for working out areas that are encompassed by main roads, and there are sizes that are sort of natural to them. But there is a huge, in almost every council, every community across the country, there are people who've been looking very hard at this problem. And again, in a crisis, I think it behoves, it's very useful as a council to be able to rely on people in the community who've been looking at these problems closely. and understanding the plans that they've already put together that might be usable. I want to go to, there's a question here, or a point here from Mark Strong, who's done great work, and we'll forward some of the documentation that Mark has put together, which gives a sort of emergency guide to what powers councils do have, saying that school streets are not as simple to implement with cameras outside London as they are in London, and we acknowledge that. I will share this, that nationally, there is lobbying going on with central government on a number of fronts, one of which is to get the cycling standards that have been agreed by all groups in the country pushed through as a matter of urgency, and also getting behind the Manchester proposal, which is to allow councils to put zebra crossings down without connecting them to Belisha beacons, which, for anyone who's ever looked at the cost of a zebra crossing, if you just use paint, they cost about £400, £500, and if you have to put lighting in because you need to run electricity to the side of the road, you're talking about £40,000. There's a question here from Liz Clements about whether or not councils have the power to ask for 20-mile-an-hour speed limits in residential areas. Is now the moment to push harder on that? And I know there's been a campaign called Lower the Baseline from key workers and doctors across the country, suggesting that we need to move very quickly to lower the speed limit in urban areas. We're seeing, maybe you can, I don't know where you are in Birmingham, but where are you on 20 miles an hour? And is now the moment to push harder on it in urban areas?
So I'm the perfect person to answer this question because Liz is my scrutiny chair, who I report to very regularly. So we've trialled a few 20-mile-per-hour zones. We're doing some assessment on them, but clearly within the consultation we carried out in the transport plan, the most popular aspect of the transport plan, and there were a number of popular things, was the 20-mile-per-hour zone. So, you know, we'll be making a very public ask of government to support us on this. I think it works economically as well. And if 90% of our roads are residential roads, we'll save a lot of money on just signage rather than introducing loads and loads of 20-mile-per-hour areas. So we'll be really, really keen to push ahead with this and go to government, because this will enable, you know, if we've got neighbourhoods, if we've got the push for active neighbourhoods, which we really want to do, if we're slowing cars down within those neighbourhoods, we're obviously making it safer for our residents to walk and cycle, which I think is really, really important. And also around the schools, we've trialled school streets. It's working. We want to roll out more of that. But if we can slow the traffic down around our schools too in our neighbourhoods, I think that will go a long way in creating a far safer neighbourhood for all.
There's a question here from Nick Moffat, which is talking about this extraordinary moment. How do we do as much as possible in as little time as possible? We talked about paint and plastic a little bit earlier, about cheap interventions, but I do want to go back to Clyde. Some of your interventions in Waltham Forest were as simple as putting planters in the middle of the road. You know, can it be done as simply as that? And then a follow-on question, I think we had a question from a councillor, I've lost the name, which was about how do you liaise with the emergency services about making changes to roads? I know that may be a highways engineer question, but if you can try and give your best answer, that would be great.
So planters are really, really easy, and rather than rush out and procure a company to do them, build them yourselves. We got our kind of highways contractor to construct ours. We just bought the wood in and then just built them to our own specification. But the issue with planters is you've got to make sure they're spaced appropriately, because you never want to underestimate someone's willingness and ability to mount a pavement or to attempt to squeeze their way through some poorly planted bollards or planters for them to be able to continue doing the same journey that they've always done by their car. So we've had examples of, you know, planters being nudged out of the way by slightly bigger vehicles, and we've had regular incidents of people mounting the pavement and sneaking to one side of where a planter's gone. So, you know, you really need to make sure you have totally reduced the space for a motor vehicle to get through, whilst maintaining the space for cargo bikes, which are increasingly a popular choice for families and businesses in Waltham Forest to get around, and clearly they need to be able to go through a modal filter just as well as anyone on a traditional bicycle, or even a child on a micro scooter. The emergency
oh, sorry, I interrupted. But on that issue of width, sorry, I just want a supplementary question. Isabel Clement, who runs an extraordinary organisation in London called Wheels for Wellbeing, which I can't recommend enough to councillors if you want to understand the issues of micromobility and all-bodied adaptive bikes. Can you that issue of spacing? You've talked about cargo bikes, but it also applies. I think we may want to talk about mobility corridors that work for wheelchairs, electric scooters. Anybody who's got in a car.
Exactly, and so it works for mobility scooters, adapted bicycles, and they can come in some pretty interesting shapes and sizes now, but largely they're not quite at the size of some of the smaller smart cars that certainly we were seeing trying to squeeze through some of our kind of bollards and planters at one point. But you kind of learn those lessons. I didn't think anyone would be as stupid enough to try and drive a brand new smart car through two bollards until one Christmas morning, where just down the road from me I woke up in the morning to see a smart car stuck between two bollards. God knows how the driver managed to get out and run away from that incident, but that happened. On the emergency services, they're statutory consultees. They've always approved our schemes because deep down they know these are the right things to do. The ambulance service knows this sort of stuff saves lives, and they are invested in that agenda, whether it's saving lives through better air quality, more exercise, more mobility, whether it's saving lives for whatever reasons, they know it's important. And the fire brigade keep coming back to us. They want more double yellow lines on corners because people aren't parking appropriately. That's what they're really concerned for. And if there is less motor vehicle on the roads, they can access where they need to access far better. And of course, with the ambulance service, for example, more paramedics, and it's about paramedics getting to the location of an accident or an incident, are on motorbikes or even push bikes, certainly in our cities. It's not necessarily about an ambulance as such, it's about the paramedics' arrival, stabilising a victim, assessing a victim, and then deciding what the next course of action is. And of course, motorbikes can easily get through our modal filters. It's a bit of a bugbear when it's a pizza delivery scooter rider, but actually when it's a paramedic on a motorbike, then that's fine. Let's go with that. Oh, and the fire brigade, of course, saw improved response times in Waltham Forest after we started putting in our modal filters as well. So,
I think this is really important. I mean, we've got less than 45 days, depending on what happens with central government announcements at the weekend. This drop in public transport capacity means there will be an increase in private car use, and it will either crush or suffocate the walking and cycling that we are seeing on streets. We need to have plans around that. I'm conscious it probably doesn't apply to London boroughs, but Wasim, I don't know if this is an issue in Birmingham. Do you have issues with pavement parking? Is that allowed in Birmingham City itself? Because I know that one of the very simple measures that can be used in many constituencies across the UK is simply to say that, for example, pavement parking is not allowed because it constrains the very space we need for social distancing.
So not just pavement parking on grass verges is an issue in many neighbourhoods across Birmingham, and we're currently working on how we can address that. We've done double curbing. We've had a number of trials around how we can prevent people from doing that, but we really need to do something. But there is that whole phenomenon of three, not just one car per household, but at times 2, 3, and 4 cars per household, and we've got to really change from that particular culture. That our roads were not built for parking for 3 or 4 cars per household, and it's the whole cultural shift that we're going to do. And for me, I think part of the challenge also is we're an incredibly diverse city, Birmingham. We've got a big South Asian community, a big African Caribbean community, and there's a real cultural issue, a cultural pattern away from walking, and in particular cycling in some of those communities. There's also that class issue. I remember when I started to learn to cycle a couple of years ago, my mum was like, hold on, you've gone back onto the bus, you've got a new car, you've gone back onto the buses, and now you're cycling. What's going on here? Because culturally, you go the other way around. You go from walking to cycling to a bus to a car, and then you get a nicer car every year. So I've gone the other way around. So I think there's a lot of cultural aspects. But right now, when you go to the local park here in Lascelles, where I am, you see families walking, families cycling, and they're enjoying it. There's leisure cycling has really gone through the roof during this COVID period, and it's how we can build upon that moving forward. And just one final point before you come back, Chris. This shouldn't be a COVID intervention. What we've got here is we've got a flavour of it. We need to absolutely make this policy and have political will behind this and make these changes forever.
Absolutely. I think we have John Burke dialed in, who's the transport lead for Hackney. John, can you hear us?
I can, yeah. Can you hear me?
All right. Yeah, we can. And I apologise. You may have been in early. I didn't spot you.
No, apologies. I arrived late on. Anyway, another meeting ran over, and it's my wife's birthday, so
you were beaten to it by Lambeth for the second time, John, in terms of a transport strategy. But I do want to get you in on this point, because I think I know you've spoken very passionately and publicly about, there is a need to react to the emergency right now. There's a need to think about how we stop cars flooding our streets, but also there's a need to link this to longer term plans. I know many councils on this call will have made announcements about net neutral carbon targets for 2030. John, can you share a little bit about what you're doing in Hackney and how you're thinking about this challenge?
With specific reference to land transport emissions or road safety and improved social distancing?
I'm interested in both the immediate actions you're taking, but also how you're linking it to a longer strategy.
Well, obviously, like a lot of other local authorities, we already had kind of pre-existing ambitious decarbonisation commitments. That included, where possible, land transport emissions, not just from fleet, but from kind of those emissions more broadly in the borough, over which we have kind of less control. And that was firmed up, I think, by our climate emergency motion, which I know that the vast majority of other local authorities have delivered, albeit with kind of different targets last year. So I think we were kind of well on our way to developing a series of proposals and interventions that are consistent with the work that we now know we need to just to expedite much faster. Now, when I say we now know that we need to expedite much faster, I think one of the big challenges here, one of the things that we more
John, the audio is very poor, and I don't think it's just me. Is anybody else having issues?
Better?
Go ahead.
I won't reiterate that, but the point I was going to make was, I think one of the challenges that we're finding in Hackney now is that though we had fairly kind of radical plans in place and a good record of delivering interventions like school streets and modal filters, and that's been a contributing factor in one of the highest cycling rates and active travel rates in the country. I think what we're finding now, and certainly what I'm finding as a councillor, apologies to any officers who are in the room, is that there's a bit of a lag between the enthusiasm that elected administrations have and the kind of natural caution that officers have to deliver the kind of interventions that we know need to happen if we're to head off the prospect of a huge air quality crisis in a local authority that has the 6th worst air quality of 418 local authorities in the country. So I think one of the things that we're really looking for, hence why the Mayor and I sent a letter to Grant Shapps and the DFT recently seeking clarification on what they think how far they think local authorities should be going at this time, is that response so that we can engage with our officer corps all the way up to the chief executive to make it clear that these interventions aren't the peccadillos of elected members who are seeking a crisis to deliver active travel interventions under the cover of coronavirus crisis. These are an urgent and pressing necessity to hedge off the very serious secondary effects of coronavirus as the lockdown is released. So I think one of the big challenges now is, I think a lot of councillors will be finding this, bringing a naturally circumspect officer call with this and having them recognise that the world has just rapidly changed in the space of several weeks, and we need to be able to respond in proportion with that pace of change. So I think that's the big challenge that I'm facing now.
Yeah, so now I would say this to all councillors on the call and all councillors on the call. I think you should expect to see very clear signalling from central government that they are expecting emergency transport plans. The modelling is overwhelming. We are about to face a crisis of how we move in the country, and we are going to have to work out how we reallocate space. Whether or not central government actually moves on funding, we will see. But it is possible to do a lot with a little in an emergency. Bizarrely, the ability to move without consultation because it is an emergency, the fact they're temporary measures that you may have to move in 6 months, so you don't want to make them in stone. You want to use temporary materials, and you want to use paint, you want to use cones. The fact that some of the measures, just removing on-street parking or using cones outside shopping centres, in themselves are not expensive. It is possible to do a lot. And I'm just looking at the poll results here. I was asking what do you see as the blocker? It seems to be funding. And again, I think if you're moving very quickly, it is possible to do a lot with a little, although there will have to be a correction from central government on this front. And then local political concerns, again, we will follow up with more information about both imagery and information. In fact, I am tempted, I'm going to do it actually, just to share a screen. Craziness at the last minute on this call, just to show you what you can build in a very short time. Is my screen visible to everybody?
Oh, do we have to see this again?
You do. This is Waltham Forest before
Rubbing it in.
Low traffic neighbourhoods, and that's after. And that's the act of blocking a street before and after. Again, a street here, 20 miles an hour, but really not that attractive to send either a 10-year-old or an 80-year-old down. Same street, simply blocked. And that is what is possible to do. We have run out of time, and I want to say a huge thank you to our panelists today. In a short hour, I think what we've discovered is across the country that many councils are already moving. There are people with plans that are published. Adam in Leicester making key worker corridors. We know in Bradford, they've announced 20 miles an hour across the whole of the city. Wasim in Birmingham has led changes on pavements and accelerating low traffic neighbourhoods. And Clyde in Waltham Forest is showing what can be done both with existing programs and then accelerating new. And I know that John has got very ambitious programs for Hackney. This is possible with political will. We really need to seize the moment, be willing to work in a different way, and go and work hard in our communities to make them understand that a different allocation of space on our streets is possible. I wish you all the best. I hope you get a chance over the weekend. I want to say thank you very much for joining us today. We will follow up with materials after the webinar. Thank you all.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you.